Welcome to Penn State Dickinson Law's Profiles in Leadership series. My name is Daryl Lim. I serve as the H. Lady Montague Chair and Associate Dean for Research and Innovation at the Law School. This series offers an unparalleled opportunity to gain insights from top leaders who serve in government, education, the private sector, and civil society. In each episode, we invite leaders to reflect on their journey and share skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. We're very pleased to have Dr. Dayna Bowen Matthew, who is the Dean and Errol H. Greene Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School. Dean Matthew is a leader in public health and civil rights law, and she focuses on disparities in health, healthcare, and the social determinants of health. She's the author of the best-selling book, Just Medicine, A Cure for Racial Inequality in American Healthcare, and Just Health, Treating Structural Racism to Heal America. Dean Matthew lives in Washington, D.C., and her partner, Thomas Matthew, MD, and her enjoy all things outdoors, including running, alpine, skiing, travel, and spending time with family and friends. Welcome, Dean Matthew.
What a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with your transition. So you joined GW 2020, and you joined from University of Virginia. What made you decide that this was the right transition to make at that point in your life?
As with many things in life, it was serendipitous. My husband and I moved to Washington, D.C. in 2017. I had the privilege of going back to my alma mater, but it meant a 100-mile commute. And I did it for 3 years, would have done it for 30 more, but I have a lead foot. And so the drive up and down Route 29 became treacherous, not only from a safety standpoint, but from an economic standpoint. I'll let you make the inferences beyond that. So I began to look for a job in Washington, D.C. The Legal Academy offers many wonderful options here in Washington, D.C., 6 schools. And so I interviewed at 2 of them, got offers from 2 of them, and chose the George Washington University deanship.
And what did you do to prepare yourself for day one as dean?
That's a great question. I did 3 things. 1, I met for 30 minutes with each member of the faculty so that I could understand their perspective on the school's strengths, weaknesses, and needs and future. And also, I perceive the role as serving their career objectives. So I wanted to understand what their scholarly agenda and teaching aspirations were. The second thing I did was hire a consultant to do a listening tour before I started. And the listening tour was the way for me to get to know all of the administration, all of the staff, all of the departments of the school. As a side note, that idea came from, and you could argue this was a 4th thing that I did, a network of deans who were supporting new deans. Some very good friends, including the dean of Penn State Dickinson Law, who is a wonderful leader and a generous mentor. Danielle Conway spent, I would say, over 3 months with me, just sitting down and talking to me about ideas to prepare me. Among them was the listening tour. So that was the second thing, and the idea came from Danielle and a group of other deans that were helping to prepare new deans. And then thirdly, I spent a lot of time on budget issues. I asked for every piece of paper that had to do with the finances of the school for the 5 years that preceded me. And I met with the various individuals here that do the financial decision making, and I studied. So those were the 3 main things I did to prepare. And may I say, it wasn't enough.
Forewarned is forearmed. So 2020 to 2023, looking back now, what were some of the leadership lessons you learned since day one until now?
I learned so many that to choose a few will be the task here since our time is limited. the first leadership lesson I learned was that there's a difference between working as a faculty member and working as the leader of a school. As a faculty member, I had the liberty, the privilege to pursue my own agenda, scholarly and otherwise. As the leader of the school, I have to survey all agenda, all viewpoints, all perspectives, and represent and reflect them all. That was one of the great challenges. And I learned that my perspective really had to shift from individual to institutional. That was one of the main things. The second thing I learned is something that I'd heard in maybe sort of trite platitudes, but it turned out to be really true as a leadership proposition, and that is you have to look backwards in order to look forward. So it turned out that the history of this school and what was in its DNA, even from its founding, became very important in shaping its vision. And that lesson would have been lost on me had it not been for the fact that I joined during the middle of the pandemic and therefore had only virtual access to my entire community and had to find a way to energize a vision without having personal contact with people. And so reaching backwards to figure out, for example, this school was founded literally months after the Civil War ended. So consensus building, nation building, communication across divides in our DNA. So I could call upon that, even though I was an outside dean, someone new to the community. So looking backwards in order to vision forward would be a second really big lesson I learned. And then a more personal last lesson was that I had to tone down my work style. So I love being in the academy, and I can be faulted for being a little bit of a workaholic. And as a single faculty member, you can spend 10 hours preparing a 1-hour lecture and nobody's going to object to that. But when I take that same work ethic into the dean's office, the rest of my staff will try and keep up with me until they burn out. And so I had to change my work style in order to make it possible for all of us to succeed. And that was a huge lesson for me.
When did that moment of epiphany come? Was it
On the last one?
Self-reflection, feedback
Oh,
from...
no. It was somebody resigning and saying, I just can't keep up. And I was like, but you're so good. They're like, yeah, I just can't keep up.
And who's your sounding board now, or your safety brakes to make sure that you don't go into hyperdrive?
I have a lot of those. Some of the people in the dean's office have really been really instrumental. I have an assistant who's like gold, Chaka Butler, and she'll calmly come in and say, Dean, do you want to take a walk? That means stop.
Speaking truth to power.
Just stop producing. We have a sort of a three, not a sort of, but we have a 3-person leadership. I have 2 senior associate deans, one of administration and one of academic affairs. And they'll say to me, Dean, we can handle this for you. We can handle this for you. And that's gotten me a lot more external time to be the external face of the institution, to activate our 33,000 strong network of alumni and traveling internationally to meet our network overseas more. And also intellectually presenting my own scholarship more so that I can be an exemplar for my faculty of what I expect of them as well. So a lot of people keep me accountable.
And GW is a big school.
Yeah, GW is a very big school.
Now, so at some point you've got to delegate, and you've got to still keep your delegees accountable to you. So how does that structure work with you at GW Law?
It has evolved over time. Professor Lim, when I first started, it was the middle of a pandemic, and I was a micromanager out of necessity. as my team became stronger, as my vision became clearer, as we emerged from the pandemic and we had many things underway that really signaled growth and just positive developments, adding new clinics, adding new health law program, a new IAP program, hiring new faculty. As things started to gain momentum, I was able to take my hand off of the day-to-day, I would say, micromanaging. I had a whole new leadership team turnover. So I hired a new Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Dean so that my students had a point of contact that was not me anymore for our Juneteenth resolution against racism. We had an anti-racism resolution. My senior associate deans also have a real clear sense of our strategic plan. And let me say that the second year, we spent a whole year coming up with a 5-year strategic plan. I think that was the difference maker if I really reflect on it. Once we had the hard conversations, over 150 members of our community participated in developing a 5-year strategic plan with 6 priorities. That gave us a roadmap. It inspired us. It helped us to do resource allocation, and it pointed our direction and guided our decision making in a way that I think allowed me to make a change.
Thanks. And how do you make sure that you still keep your finger on the pulse when you take a step back?
I do have meetings with my direct reports on a regular cadence. There are far fewer of them than there would have been in 2020 when I first started. Since we have the strategic plan, I have leadership in each one of the implementation priorities, and I meet with them. And I have, again, a smaller group, but a set of direct reports, my senior associate deans. Anybody that deals with money reports to me directly. So that's admissions and finance. And anybody that deals with my students directly. So that's the dean of students. And after that, I am really lucky to have a leadership team that I trust to delegate to.
In terms of direct contact with faculty and students?
So our faculty every Monday and Wednesday gets together for a scholarly conversation. And so either it will be a work in progress, an outside presenter, or an appointments job talk. So we eat lunch together and have scholarly conversations every single week, twice a week. Once a year, I take 3 weeks and I read anything that our faculty has newly published. And I offer another 30-minute conversation with our faculty. And we have just lots and lots of activities going on. So I co-teach a course with one of my faculty members. I have just started riding my bike to work, and that's because of another faculty member who lives near me. So there's a large school with a small community feel. As far as getting ready contact with my students, I do a couple of things. I am a runner. I'm not a marathon runner anymore. So a couple of times a semester, I meet students at 7:30 for a run. I will say I got that idea from Jim Ryan, the president of UVA. And he runs more frequently than I do, but I run 3 or 4 times a semester. And then I take a bike ride with students, and they sign up and do those. I have a couple of student advisory boards, and I meet with student leaders once a month as well. So that's the way I keep touch.
What a schedule, but a very thoughtful one. Alumni, what's your strategy for alumni outreach and engagement?
We started with a rollout plan, and the rollout plan took me to the 10 cities where most of our alumni were located. We did that virtually in 2021. I started in 2022 doing that in person. It was so exciting. And then in 2023, I returned to the lead cities, and then we had a group of cities that were smaller alumni population. So we call those regional rollouts. So it's taken me 2 years to get around the country twice. I've gone to Europe once and done 4 countries in Europe. I'm going to South America, in fact, next week, to meet with our alumni there. And we have a regular cadence of what we call alumni and admitted student receptions, where, again, having over 33,000 alumni mean that we have markets from all 50 states, sort of gather with students that are admitted from those markets. And it's a great way to show students the resource that you get from going to a huge school. You go to New York, if you go to the DMV, you're going to get 10,000 GW grads in those venues. So last night, for example, we had an alumni reception for what we call the DMV, DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And I welcomed a group of alumni from a cohort of 10,000 people in this area. And so it was a great turnout and great time. And we do that in almost every one of our top cities at least once a year.
Cool. One more question before we switch gears to you. So one more question about the law school and your work there. The Equity Institute. Tell us about that and how did it get started? And from a leadership perspective, what kind of obstacles you might have encountered, your vision, deliverables. Tell us all about it.
I'm so grateful to be able to talk about the Equity Institute. Good luck getting to any other questions after this. So the Equity Institute is, I'm sure you know, Professor Lim, it is a research institute dedicated to deploying the resources of research and pedagogy to eradicate racial and socioeconomic inequality. Here in the United States and abroad, I have a firm conviction that as a member of the higher education community, I have a social contract with society. And that social contract is I'm going to make better citizens and I'm going to produce new knowledge. So that's what the Institute is doing, training better citizens to serve an anti-racist agenda and producing new knowledge to accomplish the same. Now, I have to admit, I got super, super lucky because we chartered the Equity Institute inside of 3 years. So it was 2 years and change when I started, from the time we started, to charter the Institute as a new interdisciplinary institute all across the George Washington University. And the way we did it, literally, if you would imagine me coming to Foggy Bottom in downtown Washington, D.C., coming onto the GW campus and standing smack in the middle and saying, does anybody here do race equity work? If you do, why don't you join me right here in the middle in this spot? And people came running. Now, because of my experience at the University of Virginia and the University of Colorado, I wasn't surprised that the people who came running did not know each other. So we have 10 schools and colleges here, and people came from the engineering school, from the Arts and Sciences College, from the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy, from our Cochrane Arts program, all over. And they didn't know one another. And they didn't know they were all engaged in work that was equity facing. So the first thing we did was build community. We did a showcase that was internal. We didn't invite, really, we had two external speakers, but it was all internal speakers. And all people did all day was go from room to room to room and hear about one another's research. We did that for our domestic equity research in the spring and the fall, and our international or global equity research. Just fascinating projects. And then we sent out seed grant money. We're very lucky to raise a little over $2 million the first 2 years. We sent out seed grant money and said to all of the equity researchers who were successful in a campus-wide competition, publish, raise new funds, teach students, and do it in consistency with our vision. Here's $75,000. And that's how we got started. What were the obstacles? It is not easy to integrate teaching in a university across subjects when it is as large as GW is. So 10 schools and colleges, Each class has 24,000 plus students, undergraduate. My law school has 1,900 students, and making it possible to teach a class as we do, both in the School of Data Sciences and the School of Law, is challenging. So breaking down those silos that are not meant for the interdisciplinarity that we are known for, that's been a challenge. I'd say the other big challenge, the Equity Institute at GW is dedicated to community-based participatory research. It's a research institute, but it's a research institute that takes its marching orders from the people in our surrounding communities that we want to impact, making them making our community partners authentically co-creators. We pay them. For example, I get paid for my time. If I'm co-creating a medical legal partnership with Bread for the City, which is a nonprofit that runs a federally qualified health clinic, they should be paid for their time as well. So making that commitment to authentic community partnerships, co-creating our research projects, really doing community-based participatory research, that's been a challenge.
And what do you do to institutionalize this so that 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road, if you're no longer part of this institute, it's going to have that longevity to continue and continue doing the good work that it's been doing?
That's a terrific question, because legacy is not what you leave, it's what people do because you were there, right? So the legacy I want to leave is that this institute will exist in perpetuity. So one thing I'm doing is fundraising, right? So I'll use the word endowment more. It's going to be make sure I have financial reserves so that whether I'm there or not, whether I'm raising money or not, there's a set of reserves that are spinning off income so that the work is financed even after I end my leadership of it. The second thing is that we located it in the provost's office. So it's a university versus a law school entity. A research institute that is a law school entity would survive as long as the law dean considered it a priority. This was chartered out of the office of the vice provost of research, OVPR here, and its administration is in the provost's office. We had to have board level approval, so it's an institutional commitment. We also received institutional funding so that the commitment was made tangible, if you will. And for those reasons, I am confident that it will be like its predecessors. I worked with a fabulous group of people at the University of Virginia who actually have been up several times to help us create the institute here. And their equity center at the University of Virginia is thriving. That was an inspiration to us. And so we used several of the same principles, if you will, that worked at UVA, a much smaller project at the University of Colorado. It was called the Colorado Health Equity Project. That entity's medical legal partnership is thriving, even though CHEP itself is no longer there. So I learned along the way and used the principles that worked at UVA here.
Wonderful. I promised we'll talk about Hamilton. So your favorite quote, as I understand it, is "This is not a moment. It's a movement." Why does that resonate with you?
Oh my gosh, I could talk for hours about that. I'm going to go again backwards a little to answer the question going forward. I was really not looking for a deanship, right? So I was looking for a job in Washington, D.C. I got a great offer at Georgetown. That was a wonderful offer to be a faculty member. And there's a lot you can do as a faculty member. I think the power of the pen is enormous, and the influence that you can have wielding that power in the form of your pen from the capital of the United States of America is non-trivial. So that was a wonderful platform for me to do the kind of equity and public health work, civil rights work that was really core to my heart and core to my being. This deanship idea, however, gave me an even larger platform. After all, I could create an entity that was university-wide and involved. We have 10 schools, 9 of them are involved in the leadership of the Equity Institute at some level, are involved in the current strategic planning process of the Equity Institute. So the levers were just so much greater. Being in Washington, D.C., starting during the 2020 pandemic, I got to walk around and go to the Black Lives Matter rally on the steps of the Capitol. My office faces G Street and 6th, G Street and 20th, and on January 6th, the Proud Boys were running right past my office, and I had to shelter my staff in place during the riot that attempted to take over the Capitol. So I had, now the answer to your question, I had a front row seat to the possibility that if I would take a step beyond a faculty member, beyond being a faculty member, and take on the leadership of the school, I could be part of a movement to defend democracy, which is what I believe law schools are called to do. We're called to make society better. And this society, you've heard the saying, democracy is the worst system except for all others. This society has a democracy in peril. And I have the privilege of educating future heads of parent-teacher organizations, state legislatures, places of religion, nonprofit organizations, all the way up to the federal government, agencies, White House, judges. I'm educating leaders of democracy here and abroad. And that seems like a movement.
Let's take a step back. This is actually, in a sense, a historical moment as well, because elected leaders are debating whether to keep the government open.
Yeah.
Is this a failure of leadership? What can we do in educating lawyers and educating citizens in thinking about what leadership means at the highest levels of government?
From where I sit, this is a failure of leadership because it's a shutdown that is, in my opinion, fueled by partisanship. When we make the decision to admit a student to any law school, but certainly to the George Washington University Law School, we make a decision to help train someone who is able to have problem-solving, solution-oriented conversations across the most bitter divides. So what we can do as legal educators is teach people how to talk to and reach decisions with people they disagree with. And that would have helped avoid and avert a government shutdown, in my opinion, that's imminent today.
So one of the slides that you show in your presentations is that of a forest of redwood trees. And the point that you make, and you can make the point more eloquently than me, but I'll just sketch it out, is the idea that we're all interconnected. You also make the point that many of the structural issues that we face are perpetuated by law. To what extent can we move beyond the law in trying to dismantle some of these things and building trust and building empathy and building equity in the process, rather than just go on a rights-based approach to this is the way forward?
I love that image because redwood trees are so strong. When I was in Colorado, I also used from time to time aspen trees because they're so beautiful. But none of them stand alone. They look as though they're individual organisms, but none of them stand alone. A lot of times I'm talking to non-legal audiences and trying to convince them that the solutions that are recommended by their research, let's say it's a medical audience, trying to address health disparities, and they do research that shows this drug is not being distributed equitably across populations. That knowledge can only be implemented into a policy solution if they join with lawyers, right? So you don't stand alone as a very strong industry in medicine. We don't stand alone. Please join us in law, medical legal partnerships. But I also believe that the low-hanging fruit has been picked with respect to the kind of work I'm interested in doing in my research, which is justice, equality, fairness, anti-racism. That work can only be done across disciplines, hence the interdisciplinarity of the Equity Institute. I cannot create solutions. I'm going to resort to health examples because that's my area. I cannot create solutions for health access in rural Missouri, where I was 2 days ago, without working with engineers who help me create mobile health units that run on electricity or solar power so they'll be clean for the environment. I can't do it without crossing my legal knowledge, right? That talks about how to change the reimbursement schedule so that rural Missourians can get health coverage for telehealth and mobile health. Even if I have that solution, I can't get it to them without engineers. And I can't get it to them without social workers who are going to be trusted by the community to bring them out to see providers that don't live in the community. So you see, the low-hanging fruit of just making sure we have what was very difficult to achieve, the Affordable Care Act, insurance coverage now is extended, Medicaid is extended to Missouri. I'm using Missouri because I was there this week. That's a great legal solution, but now coverage has to turn into care. And that requires not just law, but engineering, not just engineering, but social work, not just social work, but a host of disciplines. So that when I get to rural, it was called Sikeston, Missouri, population maybe 20,000, I'm guessing. When I got there, the whole town was ready to talk about solutions because they understood that the easy stuff had been done. They're covered. In Missouri, their healthcare was covered, but their social determinants hadn't improved. The care hadn't penetrated. It was just marvelous. I could go on, but I think you have another question.
Well, it's a follow-on to that. So in terms of interdisciplinary work, in terms of social determinants of health, I think there's been progress, I think, in part because of the work that you have done. When we talk about racial equity, for example, one of the remarks that we hear is that white supremacy, for example, is historical. And in order to move beyond that, to have true racial equity, we need to, first of all, acknowledge the problem and dismantle the structures that create this racial or structural racism. Some people, especially if you like, the people who are benefiting from the current system, will see this as an assault on their way of life and an attempt to rob them of something which they have been comfortable with, which they and their forefathers might have felt like they have earned over the generations. How do you reach out to people like that and convince them that this is not about robbery, but more about revenge, but more about reconciliation?
I love this question because I'm going to use Sikeston as my example again. Just so you have context, a regional health commission in the state of Missouri did a statewide conference on how to improve the health of minoritized and marginalized populations. And in order to move, I'm going to paraphrase your question, from a scarcity mentality that there's a fixed pie, and if I take the slice that you've given me as a marginalized population and try to enlarge it, I can only do it by removing or reducing your size, the size of your slice of the pie. We have to move away from that, what I call scarcity, zero-sum mentality. And how they did it in Sikeston, I was impressed. In the state of Missouri, the whole state's organization held a virtual conference in the large city locations, Kansas City, St. Louis. It was televised from those locations. But the live conference was in a town in what's called the Boot Heel, the poorest part where, as of the data that I saw, the median income was less than $30,000 for everybody, black, white, every color, every race, in Sikeston, which is in the Boot Heel of Missouri. The conversation was broadly shared by people like me, health lawyers, health reformers, civil rights analysts, people that were talking about disparities. So we had all the data about the disparities in health in Missouri. But after my keynote, we had conversation and commentary from the chief of police in Sikeston and in Kansas City and also in St. Louis. We had commentary from faith leaders. We had commentary from social workers. We had commentary from the head of the public school district. And the conversation went across disciplines because the solutions also had to go across disciplines. But we talked about white supremacy in a whole new way, Professor Lim, from anything I've ever seen before. In this instance, we talked about the fact that the data in rural Missouri for white farmers who were dying more quickly and living sicker was parallel to the data in the most urban quarters of Kansas City and St. Louis. That the earnings disparities, the wealth gap, the educational attainment gaps were the same for white rural Missourians as they were for those who lived in the quote unquote inner city. We talked about the fact that Missouri at that time did not adequately collect data for us to even have insight into the Latino or Asian populations, and that their invisibility made the same type of disparities that they were experiencing not only invisible, but unimportant and not addressed by any of the groups. So you see, we broke down the barriers that I think politicians who want to perpetuate the ideology of white supremacy would like to see us keep erected, right? In order to keep white supremacy alive, we have to make sure that white Missourians feel as though they're better than, different than, entitled to more than Latino, African American, African, immigrant, Asian Missourians. They have to continue to feel better than, rather than to see the human connection, the similarities of the problems. They also have to point at one another as the problem, right? So they have to vote for people, whether it's for school board or zoning board or dog catcher, who tells them that the problem is those outsiders who came in here and took their position. See that scarcity mentality. There's only one pie. Instead of telling the story that when we improve access to healthcare in Sikeston, we also improve access to healthcare in downtown St. Louis. Instead of telling the story that when we enlarge the reimbursement rate or the eligibility for benefits under Medicaid for African Americans who live in the St. Louis area, we also enlarge it for people who are suffering in small towns in the Boot Heel. When we do substance use disorder counseling, when we treat mental health for people in one part of the state, we increase the resources for all. So I think white supremacy thrives in ignorance. It thrives when people have lack of contact. It thrives when people don't understand our shared humanity. And we can break those down as part of the effort, I think, to increase health access to the social determinants of health and decrease disparities in the way they did in Missouri this week.
Thank you. So I think it's important our listeners realize this is not just an academic or professional exercise for you. You've lived through, if you like, many of the things that you're trying to correct And one of the points that you make in many of your talks is you grew up in what's called Cancer Alley or Asthma Alley in the South Bronx, and the connection of four interstate highways. Your father, because he had to work two jobs, died at the age of 48, and your mother at 61. But tell us a bit more about those experiences and how they formed you into the person and your professional goals and vision that you're sharing today.
So I have a picture of my parents on my desk every day. They inspire me because my father worked two full-time jobs and another two, sometimes three part-time jobs in order to make sure I didn't have to go to public school in the South Bronx, Asthma Alley, where I lived. My mother worked another one and sometimes 1.5 jobs in order to add to that so that I could leave the public school system in the South Bronx, go to a private school 7 miles away, and end up at Harvard and hence hold this job. But when you work that hard, you die early. So it influences me every day to look at them and to realize that they made it possible for me to be here, and that I want to make it possible for another generation to come after me and have an easier road even than I did. So a lot of times I get an opportunity not just to look at my parents, but to react because I'm within steps of the Supreme Court to a decision I don't approve of. Harvard and UNC comes to mind, right? If I'm tempted to get frustrated, if I'm tempted to say that it'll be years before we regain the ground of reversing precedent that existed for 45 years, I think back on how hard others worked to make sure that I could come here. So in my slide deck, there's always a picture of someone in Birmingham, Alabama being hosed by the fire department, or someone being attacked by a dog. I drive to a beach house. I'm very lucky. I have a beach house in Delaware. I go past Harriet Tubman's trail, and I think and reflect on what it must have been like, not to drive through to my beach house, but to be running for my life. And I very deliberately and intentionally remember how hard people worked so that I could get this far. That influences me whenever I get frustrated with something like the Harvard UNC decision, coming on the heels of Shelby County and Holden and so many other working, clearly designed efforts to dismantle the civil rights progress that we've made. I renew my energy. I have a favorite song. One of my favorite songs is I Don't Feel No Ways Tired. And I just remember how hard others worked so that I could be here.
Thank you. So you mentioned Tim Keller in one of your remarks, and the context of this was justice and the idea that we need to make certain that even the vulnerable members of our society had an equal opportunity to experience the same resources. Talk about how theology might inform your worldview and the work that you do.
You may be the best prepared interviewer I have ever spoken with. Professor Lim, I am inspired by Tim Keller because he writes so deeply and so complexly about the complexity of the concept of justice, which I would say is probably, if I were to define my core values, it's got to be one of my top 3. And it is a value that I see in not only Tim Keller's writing, but I have what I would call a life verse or scripture that's also in my office, and I read it not every day, but often. It comes from the Old Testament book of Proverbs, the 31st chapter and the 8th and 9th verse. And paraphrased, it says, speak up for the needy, cry out against injustice, and be the voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Over the years, that has become my calling. That has become how I identify. Will I say it in legal terms? I think I will. cases of first impression. So a lot of times a decision will come to me, a scenario will come to me, a problem will come to me, and I won't have a template or a precedent to call upon. Instead, I have to call upon my core values, justice being one of them. And I ask myself, how will the answer I choose help the needy, give voice to those that don't have voice, speak to the oppressed? And if I can do that, that gives me a path forward to design answers for questions I hadn't faced before. So I can honestly say that in answer to your question, faith turns out to be the source of my core values, which I hope inform everything I do.
And I don't think I can beat that last question. So I better end while I'm ahead. And because I know Chaka might be anxious to
Here,
switch to the next meeting.
I was trying to look at the camera.
I'll just give you the floor and maybe just wrap up in a minute or two. What do you like to leave with our listeners?
I think this is so, it's such a privilege to have had this conversation. I do lead a law school, but I never imagined that I had enough experience to give you a profile in leadership. And so I hope the audience and listener gets something out of it, but I certainly did. It was an opportunity for me to reflect and to really rejoice in the things that I have the privilege to do as a leader. So thank you.